Welcome to Farm Drainage University. In this installment, we're going to be talking about grade. If you've heard the term grade when referring to farm drainage tile, essentially what we're talking about is the amount of fall from one end of the tile to the other. The more grade or the more fall the tile has, the faster the water will flow. For example, a very common grade to put tile on is 0.1% of fall. That's not very much grade. In fact, that is only 1 foot in 1,000 feet. So that would mean that this tile extending over 1,000 feet would only have 1 foot of fall. So essentially, the outlet of the tile would be at this height, and the very ending of the tile would be at about this height. So over 1,000 feet, if that was a 1,000-foot run, this is all the farther it would drop. To put that into perspective, within 100 feet, that would be about the amount that it would drop. Only about an inch, well actually less than an inch and a half, 1.2 inches within 100 feet. Now let me really get your attention. Within 10 feet, just a little over the length of this table, maybe double the length of this table roughly. Within that amount of space, we're only talking a drop of 1/8 of an inch. That's why when you hear people talking about grade, they talk about how good is the grade system on their tile plow and how well does their plow keep grade. Or if they're putting it in with a trencher or an excavator or whatever other tool they're using to install drainage, they are concerned about the grade and how accurate that grade is. Now I mentioned the 0.1% grade. I've got a few figures written down here. If instead of 0.1%, we were able to bump that up to 0.4%, that'd be quite a bit more fall. That means within 1,000 feet, we've got 4 feet of fall rather than simply 1 foot of fall. That would mean that over 100 feet, we would have about that much drop in just 100 feet. That means somebody could mess up the tile and still have it run water halfway decent. Now I'm not saying that to encourage anybody to be careless in their tile installations, but what I am saying is sometimes where there's been quite a bit of grade, it's covered up some faulty tile jobs just because there's enough fall that's much more forgiving. If you've got an area where it's fairly flat or you have a dip that isn't much higher than your outlet, even if the area is fairly hilly before you get to that dip, if you don't have much room to raise that tile up when you get to that dip and you have to have these really low numbers for grade, like 0.1%, we actually installed some a while back that was at 0.005% grade. That's almost flat. That's like 1/16 of an inch in 10 feet. You can't really even measure that accurately. When I say you can't measure that or I can't measure that, what we do is we have lasers and computers that measure that for us when we're doing the install. So there are ways to do it accurately, but I'm just saying with the naked eye, with a tape measure, with a stick, it's really difficult to measure that little bit in that amount of distance. That's why it's so important that the equipment be working right and that the installer be taking careful care to pay attention to if anything goes wrong. Because in those tight variations, such a little bit of difference can really make the difference between whether the tile lasting or working at all even. As we look at these numbers, there's a couple other things to consider. Not only does having more slope or more grade, more fall, those words are sometimes used interchangeably, but the more slope or grade you have in a tile, the more forgiving it's going to be to mistakes. But the other aspect is water's going to flow faster if I've got the tile turned like this versus than if I have it almost flat. So the steeper you have the tile running, the more water will flow. Now going back to that 1/10% grade, now a lot of our flat ground, or even when you're trying to catch a little hole in a dip, that 1/10% grade is a fairly common number. It's surprising how often that's the parameters that we end up using. And when you look at that 1/10% grade, that is about 3 acres that will be drained on a 4-inch single wall tile. If you have a dual wall tile, that means that there's another layer of plastic on the inside that makes the tile smooth and the water runs faster, it flows better. But I'm just going to give you the numbers for the single wall at this point. And so when you're looking at 1/10% grade, normally what we're trying to shoot for is between a 3/8 and a 1/2 inch drainage coefficient. Essentially what that's talking about is the amount of water that we're removing from the land in a 24-hour period. And usually for economic reasons, we're looking about that 3/8 to 1/2 inch. And right in the middle of that, you end up with 3 acres at a 1/10% grade. Now, if we were to jump that up to 0.2% grade, in other words, instead of 1/8 of an inch every 10 feet, we were at 1/4 of an inch every 10 feet, we could actually have 4 acres instead of 3. If we jump that up to 0.4%, we would actually have 6 acres. Now, if we really jumped it up, say instead of a 1/10% grade, we're at a full percent grade. In other words, jumping it up 10 times. So that would be just over an inch within 10 feet. If we were able to jump it up to 1% grade, we could get 9 acres off of that instead of 3. So just because we have 10 times as much fall, that doesn't mean we have 10 times as many acres drained. We only have 3 times as many acres drained by increasing it by 10 times the amount of fall. So we need to be very careful when we're figuring this up. Prinsco actually put out a drainage slide chart to figure all that out. It was in cooperation with the Minnesota Extension Agency. These are getting harder and harder to find. One of the reasons they're getting harder to find, you can get apps on your phone now that do the same thing and do it a lot quicker. There's also places on the internet. I've got a couple of flow charts listed on our webpage by some of the drainage suppliers. They're very handy. You can just punch the numbers in, find out how many acres are drained, knowing how much fall or slope you have in your ground. Now, of course, you're going to need GPS or laser to even calculate to know how much slope you have. But if you know that figure, you can come pretty close. You could even go on Google Earth and get kind of close on some situations. I wouldn't take that to the bank for your final install. Let's just say you're sitting around in the wintertime, the ground's froze up, the snow's deep, and you're just trying to plan a tile run in through your field for the future, and you want to get kind of close, and you know, is it even close to 1% grade, or are we going to be closer to that 10%, or is it even going to work to drain it? Sometimes you won't know until you go out there with the laser or the GPS. But you could start figuring and planning ahead of time is where I'm going with that. Let me just mention, if instead of 1% grade you had 2%, you could actually drain 12 acres with this same tile. The spacing is going to be something that comes into consideration there too, because at 3 acres, if you had 100 feet spacing, that means this line could only be about 1,300 feet long to get that right in the middle of 1/2 inch and 3/8 drainage coefficient. But if you're going every 50 feet, then we're talking 2,600 feet. So that's about a 1/2 mile. So on a typical quarter section of land, 1/2 mile rounds, you could have a whole length across that field if you were able to get a 1/10% grade and you were going every 50 feet. We did an install a while back. I mentioned how we had to put some in that was only 5/100ths of a percent grade. So we're talking 1/16 of an inch every 10 feet. And that was on a 15-inch dual wall. And I'm just going to give you the figures for a 3/8 drainage coefficient on a 15-inch dual wall at 0.05% grade. That means we're only able to drain 100 acres with that huge tile. Even though it's a 15-inch tile, it was only 100 acres that we were able to drain. But if we could have got that up to 0.2% instead of 0.05, we would have been able to drain 200 acres. And really what we're talking about here is the difference between 6 inches of fall over 1,000 feet versus 2 feet of fall over 1,000 feet. Can make the difference between 100 acres drained and 200 acres drained. That's why when you're figuring tile installations, it's so important to know what your grade is, how much fall you have, how much slope you have, to know how fast that water is going to run, to know how efficient your tile is going to work. One of the other considerations is if you have soil that tends to silt, usually what we're talking about there is fine grains of sand that are able to fall through these little slits in the tile to let the water in. If you don't have the tile steep enough, in some situations that'll fill with sediment and can end up plugging the tile. In those situations they do have special tile. It either has really narrow slits or else is covered in sock. But even in those situations, ideally you want to have it as steep as possible so that that water can roll through there faster, gain some velocity, and keep everything cleaned out. But there's a lot of cases where you just don't have that. That area where we put in that 15-inch dual wall, we had 1,000 feet roughly where we are at 0.05% because that ground was just so flat that we didn't have room to come up that much higher and still have room for it to drop and get a good outlet. So you run into those situations, you run into planning and trying to decide what you're going to do. But just to give you a big number before we wrap this up, in another video I mentioned about this 30-inch tile. Just imagine you had a 30-inch tile and how I said 30-inch tile could possibly drain thousands of acres depending on how steep it was. If you had a 30-inch dual wall tile at 0.6% grade, that would be 2,000 acres. So that just shows you how much this stuff can really handle if you're able to get a decent amount of grade. But that same 30-inch tile, I'm just going to use my little slide rule here, the same 30-inch tile, if we would have put it as flat as we had to put that dual wall that we did a while back, if we had to put it that flat, that same tile would only drain a little over 600 acres versus 2,000. So even though it was a huge tile, that grade or that slope or the amount of fall it had would really make a huge difference in the tile installation.